Part 3. The Mermaid's Lagoon. One fine summer evening, Peter, with Wendy and their little family, went down to the lagoon where the mermaids lived. The Never 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 Land, as you see, is full of the most strange and interesting creatures. Some of them dreadful, like the pirates, wolves, and crocodiles. Others, like the fairies and the mermaids, altogether beautiful and charming. Wendy and her brothers, who had never seen a real mermaid with a tail, were very much excited, and as luck would have it, just as they arrived at the lagoon, one of them, seated on a rock, was combing her long tresses, on which the sunlight gleamed, until they shone like a mixture of gold and bronze, for they had a beautiful greenish tinge. As she combed her hair, she sang such a wonderful melody that the boys longed to catch her. They instantly dashed into the water, but with the piercing cry of mortals, the mermaid dived out of their reach into the lowest depths. "But look, here is another little mermaid. Surely we can catch her," said John Napoleon Darling, and he very nearly did. Mermaids, however, are hard to catch, and when caught are still harder to hold. John succeeded in getting the little sprite in his hands, but wriggling like an eel, she slipped out of his grasp. Breathless with excitement, the whole band of children clambered onto the rocks when all at once a cry went up. "The pirates!" Sure enough, a boat was approaching, and in it were seated the two pirates' lieutenants, Smee and Starkey. The boys were already swimming to the shore as fast as they could, when to his horror, Peter recognized Tiger Lily sitting in the stern, tightly bound with ropes. In a flash, he guessed what was their intention. The wretches meant to leave her, all bound as she was, upon the rock, until the tide came up and drowned her. Determined to save her, Peter thought of a clever trick. Imitating the wicked captain's voice, he called out, "Cut her bonds and let her go." The effect was marvelous. The astonished buccaneers, fearing to disobey their captain, instantly released Tiger Lily, who leapt into the water and swam towards the boys. The pirates had turned and were rowing back when they saw Hook swimming towards them, and learned from him how they had been duped. Horribly enraged, he chased them out of the boat, leaving them to swim back to the ship as best they might, while he himself set about recapturing Tiger Lily. But the pirates once safely out of the way, Peter and his friends went back to the rock to attack the captain, who was not single-handed. A fierce fight ensued, Hook using his iron prong to some purpose on poor Peter, while the boys, seizing Hook's boat, rowed off with Tiger Lily in it. At last, finding himself outdone, the captain gave up the fight and in all haste swam back to his ship. Peter, left alone on the rock with Wendy, found her so exhausted that she could neither swim nor fly any farther. With difficulty, he managed to help her to a firm footing, but the tide was rising and they were both in great danger. As he watched the water silently creeping nearer, Peter almost despaired, but all at once a large kite came flying slowly over the lagoon. In a second, Peter had seized its tail and binding it tightly around Wendy, he sent her sailing away in safety, bravely calling, "Goodbye, Wendy," until she was out of sight. Then indeed, as the tide rose steadily, Peter was in great peril. The water reached his feet, and he was beginning to think it would be a tremendous adventure to die, when who should come sailing by but a great seabird on its nest, which had been blown off the cliffs by the rising storm. "Hurrah!" cried Peter. "There is a lovely boat for me." And chasing the bird off, in he stepped, curled himself round, and spreading out his coat to the wind, sailed swiftly and merrily after Wendy. Part 4. The Underground Home. The days passed merrily in the underground home, where Wendy was the sweetest little mother, and Peter the bravest father you could ever have found anywhere. The cave was large and roomy, and the rocks out of which it was hollowed were of a deep brown color. There was a fine large fireplace, and overhead, near the ceiling, were hung baskets and fishing tackle and all sorts of things likely to be useful to cave dwellers. Wendy had not been long there before she had improved the home and made it as comfortable as her own nursery. It is wonderful what clever girls can do, even with the poorest materials. There was now a huge bed for all the boys and a basket for Michael, because he was the littlest and because a cradle is such a homely thing to have about the house. And in a corner of the room, hidden behind a tiny crimson curtain, there was a wee little room for Tinker Bell, daintily furnished to suit the taste of Girl Fairy. There were stools made of mushrooms for the boys, and 2 comfortable chairs made of pumpkins, where Peter and Wendy could sit in state, as was fitting the father and mother of the little family. One Saturday night, Wendy and the boys were all downstairs together, waiting for Peter to come back from a hunting expedition. Outside, the faithful Tiger Lily and her Red Indian band were keeping guard against the pirates. Presently, the crackling of branches indicated Peter's approach through the underwood. Tiger Lily sprang up to meet him, and the Lost Boys ran to the tree trunk stairways to welcome him on his return. He was the best of fathers, and never forgot to be a little boy, for he had filled his pockets with fruits for the boys who had been good, and he let them rummage through and through his coat like rats in a corn sack. Then he turned towards Wendy, who was very busy mending the children's socks by the fireside. She looked very charming in her pretty brown frock the color of autumn leaves, with scarlet berries in her hair, and she made Peter very happy as they exchanged thimbles and talked over the boys and their doings as if they had really been their father and mother. When the children clamored for a dance, Peter even said that he was too old for such a game, and that his old bones would simply rattle, and Wendy also thought that the mother of such an armful could not go skipping about with her children. So Peter sang Sally in Our Alley, which song Wendy thought no one else in all the world could sing so sweetly as the darling of her heart, while the others danced pillow dances and bolster dances, and turned somersaults on the beds, and did all the other jolly and lively things that everyone wants to do just about bedtime, when one ought to be thinking of going to sleep. At last they quietened down for Wendy to tell them just one more story before they were tucked in for the night. They clustered eagerly round, interrupting every sentence, as children always do, even the best of them, while Wendy told her story. And the story somehow seemed familiar to John and Michael and Peter, for it was the tale of Mr. and Mrs. Darling, poor dears, who had lost their children one winter night. And how sad they were about it, how lonely they felt, and how the nursery window would always be kept open, ready for the children, if ever they should come flying home again. When she had finished, Peter stood up sadly. "No, Wendy," he said, "I thought so once, but you cannot be sure that the window will be kept open. When I went back to my mother, the window was barred, and there was another little boy sleeping in my cradle." At that thought, Wendy started up with a look of horror in her face. "Perhaps by this time, Mother may be in half mourning," she exclaimed, and John and Michael felt they dared not stay another moment in the Never, Never, Never Land. What would they do if they were too late in coming back and found other children in their beds, other children being bathed and dressed by Nana? They must go home at once. The boys crowded round Wendy, imploring her not to leave them, but she was firm. Not only would she return with John and Michael, but she would take all the boys with her for her mother to adopt. The boys, as soon as they heard themselves invited to come too, were as happy as larks. For now, each of them would have a true mother in Mrs. Darling, and would live in a house like other boys. In a moment, they were packing their baby clothes and were ready to start on their journey. Peter alone refused. He was miserable at the thought of losing Wendy, but he couldn't consent to grow old and have a beard, as he knew he must do if he left the Never 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 Land. Never, never could he do that. There was nothing for him then but to stay behind. Wendy was as careful as a little mother in pouring out Peter's medicine and made him promise faithfully to take it every night. But suddenly there was a stamping overhead and banging and a clashing and a shouting and a sound of heavy people wrestling and struggling to and fro. The pirates had taken the Red Indians by surprise. The children heard the fighting and listened like mice to the squalling of cats, as frightened as could be, while Peter waited with his sword. The battle was very soon over. The redskins were bitten and ran like hares, or crawled dangerously wounded into the thickets. The triumphant pirates were left victorious, though a little out of breath, close above the children's heads. Hook, their captain, more wicked-looking than ever, listened at the mushroom chimney. "If the Indians have won," Peter was saying, "they'll beat the tom-tom." "Aha!" thought Hook, and he picked up a tom-tom that one of the flying Indians had left behind and sounded it loudly. Rub-a-dub, dub, dub, dub. "Hurrah!" shouted the children down below. "An Indian victory!" "All will be safe," said Peter. "You may go now. Tink will show you the way." And bidding a hurried goodbye to Peter, away they all went up the stairways in the tree trunks, out into the forest. The pirates were ready for them. As each child came above the ground, he was seized by one of the swarthy ruffians who stood waiting. One by one and silently, they were captured or flung into the boats and transported to the pirate ship which had anchored in the lake close by. Everything had been done so quietly that Peter was quite unaware of his friend's sad fate. He only knew that he was all alone, that Wendy had left him, and that she and Michael and John and all the lost boys who had been his companions were on their way from the Never 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 Land to the country of the ordinary people, who wear tall hats and tailcoats as soon as they were old enough and grow up one after the other. Poor Peter threw himself on his bed and sobbed himself to sleep. Hook was still lurking about, for the one thing that annoyed him most was that Peter had not left the cave with the rest and was as yet safe. But in his wicked heart a wicked scheme had already risen by which he hoped to kill his enemy. He had carefully listened to Wendy's last words. "Be sure and take your medicine, Peter." Here was the captain's last chance. Creeping down to the door of the cave, he stretched his long arm round the ledge just inside and poured a few drops of deadly poison into the glass, and with the grin of triumph on his ugly face, he threw his cloak over his shoulder and stole away. Tap, tap, tap. Somebody was knocking at the door. "Who's there?" asked Peter sleepily. Tap, tap, tap. He got up and opened the door. Tinker Bell, tinkling excitedly, flew into the room. "The pirates have captured them," she tinkled. "The pirates have captured them." As Peter excitedly snatched up his sword and sharpened it very sharply on the grindstone, he perceived Tinker Bell in his glass of medicine. He soon learned the reason when his little fairy told him in a weak voice that he was poisoned, and that she had drunk the poison as the only way to save his life. It was indeed an act of self-sacrifice, for too well did Tink know how much Peter loved Wendy, and that no warning of hers would prevent him from keeping his promise. Poor Tinker Bell was dying, and die she would have done were it not that Peter, in a frenzy of grief and with tears in his eyes, made this passionate appeal to all children. "Do you believe in fairies? If you do, clap your hands, and that will save poor Tinker Bell." As his cry rang round the world, there came an echo of sound as of millions of little hands clapping, as if all the children throughout the world knew suddenly that of course they believed in fairies. The result was magical. Tinker Bell was saved. Her light, which had been getting fainter and fainter, grew brighter and brighter again. The merry sound of tinkling, her way of speaking to Peter, which had almost become inaudible, now grew stronger and stronger. She was once more the bright little fairy that escorted Peter to the darling nursery, and again, under her guidance, Peter set forth to rescue the boys and Wendy. Part 5. The Pirate Ship. The pirate ship was a terribly evil-looking craft, with its painted sails, its heavy tarred cordage, and its flag with the skull and crossbones upon it, flapping grimly at the stern. The poor children were at once driven into the dark and dirty hold, while Hook walked the deck, rubbing his hands and chuckling to himself to think that at last he had them in his power. "Are all the prisoners chained so that they can't fly away?" he asked me, who was very busy at his sewing machine. "Aye, aye, Captain," answered Smee. "Then hoist them up," shouted the captain. He seated himself on a chair covered with a white bear skin, waiting while the boys, whose wrists were chained together, were dragged out of the hold and brought before him. 6 of them, he said, were to walk the plank at once, but he would save any 2 who were willing to be captain boys. The children were not at first sure what walking the plank meant, but Hook soon enlightened them by roaring out a song in explanation. He sang, waving his hook to show how, when the plank tipped, they would be shot into the water and drowned. Turning towards John Napoleon Darling, he shouted, "You look as if you had some pluck in you." John hesitated. In his schoolboy days, he had always thought a pirate's life very attractive, so stepping forward, he said, "Will you call me Red-Handed Jack?" The captain laughed with delight and promised to give him that name if he joined the crew. Then Michael went up to him and slapped him on the shoulder. "What will you call me if I join?" he asked. "Black-bearded Joe," answered the captain, and until another question arose, Michael was much pleased. The cabin boys were told that they must of course wear "Down with King George," and to this neither boy would consent. John and Michael were then pushed on one side and told that their doom was sealed, while Hook shouted, "Bring up their mother." In a moment, Wendy was dragged from the hold, and when the boys rushed to protect her, they were pulled back, leaving her standing alone, looking very frightened but pretty in her brown dress, with the long brown cloak wrapped round her. Hook asked her if she had any last message for her sons who were about to die. Wendy spoke beautifully to the boys, telling them she was sure their real mothers would wish them like English gentlemen. Her courage so inspired the children that they all cried they would do what their mothers wished. Upon this, Wendy was cruelly tied to the mast, whilst Hook's orders were being carried out. But, just as the boys' fate seemed determined, something happened to change Hook's glee into terror. Tick, 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 he heard, and at the dreaded sound he yelled, "The crocodile! Hide me! Hide me!" In abject fear he rushed to a corner of the ship while his men crowded round him, intent only upon shielding their captain from the jaws of the monster. The boys, too, waited breathless with horror, until with sudden relief and rapture, they saw not the crocodile but their beloved Captain Peter Pan appearing over the ship's side. In one hand, at arm's length, he held an alarm clock, the ticking of which had made Hook believe that the crocodile was upon him. Making a sign to his friends, Peter dashed into the cabin, unseen by the pirates, and shut the door. The ticking ceased directly, and Hook's terror vanished. Returning to his dreadful purpose, he cried, "Now here's to Johnny Plank." Again he began to sing, yo ho, the frisky plank. But the boys, filled with hope and excitement, drowned his voice by singing, "Rule Britannia!" And just as the pirates was about to vent his rage upon them, he was silenced by a shrill and piercing cock's crow from the cabin. Struck motionless with terror, the crew looked to their captain for some explanation, who ordered Gecko, one of his men, to enter the cabin and see what was the matter. Hook waited, but Gecko did not return, and once again was heard the awful mysterious crowing. "Someone must bring me out that doodle-doo," roared the captain, and as no one volunteered, "I thought I heard Starkey volunteer," he said, pointing his hook at Starkey. Mad with terror of the hook as well as of the uncanny creature in the cabin, Starkey rushed wildly round the deck and finally, to escape both, flung himself overboard. Furious at this mutinous behavior, Hook shouted, "I'll bring that doodle-doo out myself." But he had no better success, and came rushing back in a cowardly fashion, saying, "Something blew out the light." A happy idea now struck him. "Drive the boys in. Let them fight the doodle-doo. If they kill him, so much the better. If he kills them, we are none the worse." This, of course, was just what the children wanted, but concealing their delight, they allowed themselves to be driven into the cabin. In the meantime, all the pirates huddled together, hiding their faces. Sailors, are very superstitious, and they all thought the ship was bewitched. So terrified were they that no one saw Peter steal out, followed by the boys, who crept silently up the ladder to the higher deck. No one saw Peter cut the ropes which bound Wendy, and take her place at the mast, and cover his face with the brown cloak she had left, while Wendy joined the boys. "It's the girl," cried Hook. "There's never a lock on a pirate ship with the woman aboard. Let's throw her over." All the men knew that their captain was right, and one of the pirates started up and shook his feet at the brown robed figure at the mast. "There's nothing can save you, missy," he cried. "There is one," came a ringing voice, and the brown cloak was flung aside, and there stood Peter Pan. "Down, boys, and at them!" he shouted, and with a rush the boys, armed with weapons which Peter had found and given them in the cabin, swarmed down upon the lower deck. The pirates believed that all the boys had been slain by the mysterious doodle-doo, and were panic-stricken as they saw them with swords and daggers. Some of the crew rushed to the bulwarks and leapt overboard. Others with their knives fell upon the boys, while Hook backed into the cabin fighting for his life. "Put up your knives, boys. That man is mine," cried Peter, pointing to Hook. The boys turned their attention to the remaining members of the pirate crew, who were one by one forced into the sea, while the two mortal animals appeared at the cabin door close in deadly combat. Each was determined to kill the other. Step by step, Hook was driven back to the side of the ship. He felt himself weakening. In despair, he cried out, "'Tis some friend fighting me. Who are you, Pan?" "I'm Youth," cried Peter. "I'm a little bird that has broken out of the egg. I'm Youth. I'm Joy." With that, he wrenched Hook's word from him and pushed him into the sea, right into the jaws of the waiting crocodile, who caught him at last. The boys burst into ringing cheers as they and Wendy crowded round their hero, who stood like a conquering Napoleon, while the pirate flag was lowered. All the pirates save two, Smee and Starkey, jumped into the sea and were drowned. Smee, the Irish pirate, who was not so wicked as the rest of the crew, managed to swim ashore and subsequently became a reformed character and a brave sailor in His Majesty's fleet. Starkey, who had never shed blood, but had been guilty of many cruel deeds, was captured by the Redskins and led a miserable life, where Great Big Little White Panther, the Indian chief, compelled him to act as nurse to the papooses of the tribe. A sad come-down for a pirate. Part 5. Home, Sweet Home. But at home, in the Darling household, all this time there was deep sorrow. Mr. Darling, as a punishment to himself for taking their guardian Nana away, had vowed that he would live in the kennel till his children's return. For months now he had lived in it, and had been carried to business in it every morning, much to the disgust of the prim little housemaid Liza. Mr. Darling had become quite a celebrity, and great ladies, leaders of society, found him so interesting and touching that they all cried out as he passed by, "Oh, do come to dinner at our house, do come in the kennel." All the newspapers had asked him to write the cricket and football news for them, and his picture postcards were to be seen in every shop window. But it happened one evening, when he returned from business, carried as usual in the kennel, he was taken up to the now desolate nursery, where Mrs. Darling spent most of her time mourning for her lost children, while the faithful Nana tried in vain to cheer her up. "George, George, I believe you are beginning to like that kennel," she said reproachfully as he crawled out. He denied the charge, however, and tried to comfort Mrs. Darling, who never for one moment forgot the little empty beds and the silence and cheerlessness of the nursery. Then he left her, and sitting down by the fire, Mrs. Darling was alone with her sad thoughts. Scarcely, however, had she closed her eyes when three little figures flew in at the window and nestled cosily in their beds. Then softly Wendy called to her mother. But when Mrs. Darling looked round, she simply couldn't believe that the children were really there. So many times before she had dreamt of their return, that it was not till they all three crowded round her that she realized that they had indeed come home. Oh, what joy to feel once more those dear faces, cool and fresh from the flight through the night air, pressed against hers, hot with tears, to hear once more the sound of those sweet voices as they all talked at once. At last, when she was a little calm, Wendy began telling her about Peter Pan and the Lost Boys, who with Peter Pan himself were all waiting outside. Directly Mrs. Darling saw them and heard that they had no mothers, she instantly adopted them all. Though the house would be rather crowded, she could easily put up extra beds in the drawing room, she said, and with the screen on her at-home days, all could be comfortably managed. The only difficulty lay with Peter. Much as at first sight he loved Mrs. Darling, much as he loved Wendy, he couldn't consent to grow up. So at last it was arranged that he should fly back alone to the Never 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 Land, and that once a year Mrs. Darling would allow Wendy to go and stay with them for a whole week to do his spring cleaning. High in the tree tops of the Never 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 Land, Tinker Bell placed the little house that was built for Wendy. The tree tops are soft as velvet, and in the evening at twilight are all bejeweled with tiny mauve and white and blue lights. The mauve ones are boy fairies, the white girl fairies, and the blue lights are darling little sillies who are not quite sure what they are. And the still air is filled with the singing of birds and the ringing of hundreds of little fairy bells. But the sweetest sound of all is the fluting of Peter Pan's pipe as he sits outside the little house and calls to the spring to make haste, because with the spring comes Wendy.